And we are live, and my microphone is not muted. Welcome to Viral Transmissions Episode 3. I'm Joe Foljam. That's Torrin Atkinson. Up there is Dr. Rob Tarswell, and above me is Dr. Simon Pratt, who is a lecturer on political science and cool stuff like that. I'll let Rob, you've been doing most of the research on this. I'll just hand this over to you. Welcome, everybody.
All right, so our guest tonight is Dr. Simon Pratt. He's a lecturer in politics and international studies at the University of Bristol. His research areas include international security and then research on the philosophy of social science, including the meanings of international relations. So we're particularly interested in getting, we went from the lowest possible level view, looking at the virus itself last week, and now we're kind of zooming out to the highest level. And so let me just start then by saying, hey, thanks for coming. You had a bit of an odyssey yourself that leads to you being here tonight, and perhaps you might, want to talk a bit about that, because that was interesting in and of itself.
I will, yeah.
And in that context, I guess what I'd be interested in is, from the political point of view, what is a pandemic as a global event?
So I'll be transparent here and say, admit that I kind of fed you that question, because something really interesting is going on here amidst all of the misery and panic, and that is that we're having something that's actually worthy of the name global event. Some of my colleagues have suggested that it could be the first global event, and I think that's probably a bit of a stretch. I can posit other ones.
Did they forget about the asteroid that killed off the dinosaurs?
Oh yeah, well that colonialism, 9/11. But there's something about this particular crisis where everyone across the world is facing some similar fears. All across the world, people are or will shortly see many in their community becoming ill and dying. And across the world, people are implementing similar mitigation measures, physical distancing, which in turn leads to social distancing. And this isn't to say that all of us experience the hardships or problems of COVID-19 in the same way, right? Of course, there'll be huge differences in terms of access to healthcare resources, whether governments actually support the poor and vulnerable or leave them to swing in the breeze. But all of us are kind of across the world. We're glued to the news. We're seeing the same type of threat in a kind of broad sense, and so that's what I mean when I say that this pandemic is a global event. And it's interesting because global events can introduce the possibility of global identities, because all of our identities, our political identities, are built out of shared experiences, or at least shared narratives about our place in the world. And so if all of us across the world are experiencing something shared, then maybe that holds the potential for some new global stories about who we are. And or when this is all over, we'll all go back to the status quo ante. And one thing that I wonder is whether, in order to confront another global crisis, which is climate change, we need something like a pandemic moving very swiftly to train us to understand ourselves in global terms, in order to confront another global crisis which is ongoing but moving so slowly that we can maybe tell ourselves that it isn't happening.
Yeah, I remember one of the I think it was an article that was going around before the COVID thing that was trying to reach out to people about, a host of social justice issues and things like that. And the title was, "I don't know how to convince you to care about other people." And maybe the answer is global pandemic will teach you that that's a good thing. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Not quite. I would not go so far as to say that there's some kind of potential for radical empathy here. There are some people who they actually just aren't very empathetic, and I leave it to the political psychologists, and I am assuredly not a political psychologist, to determine what sort of institutional situations make empathy possible when before there was none.
Right.
I would say that if we're to confront something like a global pandemic, let alone global climate change, we need to think of ourselves as linked, or our institutions and our contexts as linked or entangled with those of other communities and other places. And I saw an interesting article recently which said that right now, to deal with the crisis, all of New York State's hospitals have been incorporated into a single hospital system, sharing resources, sharing personnel. And something a little bit like that, or at least something moving in the direction of that, might have to take place in order to coordinate truly good global responses to this.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think that's really happened in Europe, and it might not need to happen in Europe, but certainly as the global south starts to get hit really hard, I wonder if something like that is likely to get set up across countries.
So less of a teaching empathy, but more of a, maybe even from a selfish point of view, recognizing that working together is what needs to happen for everybody to do well, including yourself, the selfish person. Okay.
I wouldn't even necessarily put it in terms of selfishness or self-interested coordination. I would just say learning to cooperate.
Mm-hmm.
Like cooperation. Cooperation is a habit we get into. It's a practice we can adopt, and it isn't necessarily incorporated in or bound up in careful, self-conscious calculation of cost and benefit.
Mm-hmm.
You know, if we're used to interacting with people across borders or across institutional boundaries, and we get used to that type of coordination, that type of cooperation, we start doing it. It becomes the everyday for us, and I hope that is the direction we'll all move here.
I would share that hope. Yeah.
So tell us how you ended up where you are. Let's zoom in a little bit and get the Simon story,
Mm-hmm.
or narrative, if you prefer, within this global event.
So I'm glad you asked, because there is a sense in which I and my spouse are kind of, in some respects, emblematic of some of the problems and also privileges that characterize the kind of wealthy Western experience of this right now. So I got hired at the University of Bristol, and in order to make it possible to sustain my relationship, I married my partner because I needed to do so for immigration. And obviously, I loved him, so why not pull the trigger on that? And so we got married. We moved to the UK, and we started building a life. But he has a minor heart problem, which still raises his risk should he fall ill. And we were looking around us and seeing the UK government talk about building herd immunity, and looking at the state of the NHS, the UK's version of Medicare, and its state after like a decade and a half of cuts. And we thought, we should probably move our asses back to Canada for this. I'm on sabbatical right now, so this doesn't really affect my ability to work. And my husband is still studying, and his studies are now all online. So we made a very fast decision. We booked one-way Air Canada tickets. We packed our bags. We installed a friend in our flat because he was doing lab work near campus, and this way he doesn't have to take a bus to work, and he takes care of our plants. And we, like a very stressful trip through Heathrow. We landed in Vancouver. We spent some of my my husband got fired from his part-time job. We spent some of my professor dollars on an Airbnb to quarantine in. I called it our Quairbnb, and now we're out of it, and we've sublet an apartment, which we'll be moving into shortly. And so, what are some of the things that stand out here? Well, first is the extraordinary financial privilege of having a job that I can do completely remotely, and the financial capacity to make these sorts of decisions for my health. Second, the fact that we are able to move seamlessly between two different countries and take advantage of two different healthcare systems. And so when we look at the UK and we say, wow, oh my God, this is going to be a massive fuck up, and it's one that could threaten us, we have the privilege of transporting ourselves to a place that seems to be doing very well, all things considered, which is BC, a model of responsible governance at this time. Um, and yeah, so none of this is available to people who have lost their jobs and don't have savings. It's not available to people who don't, say, have more than one citizenship or the capacity to work and live in multiple places. So that was my odyssey, and I'm very grateful to be here. I almost cried when we got through customs, and we're like, "We're here, like we're about as safe as we can be." This side of South Korea.
As it turns out,
Yeah.
BC, in terms of the English-speaking world, you are in the epicenter of safety, at least.
Also, now I can do grocery shops for my mother and uncle, who are both living alone and more concerned. So yeah, that was my odyssey, as you called it.
Yeah, very good. So, and then interestingly enough, we find out this morning that the Prime Minister of the UK, presumably who ought to be among the most protected people, is now been admitted to hospital. And they're downplaying the seriousness of it, but this is, of course, is what government PR flacks do when a leader has to be admitted to hospital. Wow, so the virus literally reaches to the highest levels of UK society right now.
Yeah.
What were his policies about this whole, like, was he a latecomer like Trump?
So it looked as though initially the UK government was following the advice of some epidemiologists from Oxford that were suggesting that the UK could avoid the gigantic economic impact of shutting so much down, and so basically shelter the old people and the vulnerable people, let the younger people get sick, and then they'll just take the hit. The rate of hospitalization will be low enough that the NHS can handle it, and at a certain point, the population will have become so broadly immune that the pandemic will be over. And then when it was the garbage assumptions of this model became increasingly apparent, and then some new modelers from Imperial College pointed out that this plan will lead to hundreds of thousands of dead people, and it completely overwhelmed NHS in short order. And then the government seemed to have realized that it's making some errors and began instituting some fairly strict distancing measures, culminating in a kind of a lockdown, which is probably too late for many people, but at least it's something, right? So when I talk to my doctor friends and the friends I have working in the healthcare system in the UK, all of them are saying something along the lines of, "We're doing the right thing, but it's kind of too late. So we're about to take a pretty big hit." I know a friend of a friend lost his dad already. I have friends who have lost elderly family members or acquaintances. So it's bad already. But hopefully in the next few weeks, the lockdown that they instituted will begin to pay off, and the curve will flatten.
Right.
Yeah, I think, like, obviously nobody wants anyone to die, but it makes me wonder, like, if the leader of Britain dies from this virus, what are the implications, not only in Britain but globally? Like, whose position is going to suddenly change?
Another unpleasant Tory takes premiership, and many of the policies that Bojo represents will continue. I think leadership transition. I mean, this is not like a one-party authoritarian state like Israel may seem, or like Hungary has well become. Right? It's not like the death of a leader leads to a gigantic shakeup. You know, in the event, probably still fairly unlikely that Johnson dies or is made so ill by this that he simply cannot continue as prime minister. I don't foresee a major change.
So no, Lord Mountbatten coup.
No.
I guess I'm just like wondering, like, it's going to start sinking into some people, for some people who it may not have sunk in before, if that happens.
I would not underestimate the cognitive limits imposed by epistemic partisanship. I think that there are people who will, it would take quite a lot to change their mind.
You're going to have to tell us what epistemic partisanship is.
So epistemic meaning pertaining to knowledge, and partisanship meaning pertaining to political parties. So like when I look at so many people in the U.S., if you look at the differences in, there's if you measure whether people care about or think that social distancing is necessary and that COVID-19 is a big deal, and then you look at the divide in terms of how you sort of cross-reference that with party affiliation, you find that Republicans are much more likely to say that COVID-19 is not a big deal and that social distancing is not necessary. You also find that Republicans are more likely to blame the CDC or blame Obama for the government's poor response right now, whereas Democrats are most likely to blame Trump. So when we talk about epistemic partisanship, well, what we mean is that based on your party affiliation, the very things that you know about the world will be different. So if you're a Republican that A, COVID-19 is not very bad, and B, it's Obama's fault.
Right.
Yeah. And I think maybe if Trump died of it, that might change people's minds. But I think short of that,
Right.
Yeah.
Someone, it was Katie. Katie Marshall asked if you could give some context on the political situation in Hungary.
So I'm simply going to repeat to you what a friend of mine who lives and works there has told me, which is that Orban and Fidesz, the ruling party. So prior to this, they hold over a 2/3 majority in parliament, so they could basically do what they wanted. It was a de facto one party, one man dictatorship. But what has happened is Orban has used the situation of the pandemic to declare emergency rule and allow him to legislate by decree. Without needing to sort of push things through parliament, and he this is indefinite, right? So he can do this as long as he decides that it's necessary. So what this really just does is put a legislative stamp on what was kind of already the case, which is certainly an escalation in the dictatorial direction of things, but it isn't like a gigantic unforeseen shift. What it does do is remove all plausible deniability from Orban that he is a one-man dictator, and it should hopefully put a lot of pressure on EU institutions and EU leaders to actually introduce some consequences for Orban and Fidesz after all this time.
God bless George Lucas for teaching me about politics in the Star Wars prequels.
Yeah,
I see parallels.
If only one of us could do an Emperor Palpatine imitation that was worth a nickel.
I mean, in a sense, is Boris Johnson not kind of like an evil Jar Jar Binks?
If Jar Jar Binks was born wealthy, I guess, and
Right.
spoiled, right? Yeah. And George Lucas taught us that even if you take the big bad guy and toss him down a giant shaft where he explodes, the problems don't go away.
Oh,
The
George
problems
Lucas
just
didn't
come
teach us
back.
that. Somebody else taught us that.
Yeah. Okay. Fair.
So interesting comment in the Twitch feed. Where did it go? What complicates the epistemic partisanship is that there is a distinct media ecosystem. It's not just that beliefs follow party. It's that facts follow party to a large extent.
Yes, that's a very important point here. Is that the right wing in the U.S. is a fairly closed informational ecosystem. So I sit most of my day in front of my Twitter feed, just wreathed in various news sources firing off facts at me, and I might raise my eyebrow at one or two of them, but I can just quickly and reliably cross-reference information with a bunch of other sources. So I'm looking at Reuters, BBC, New York Times, Washington Post, several Israeli newspapers, several British newspapers, CBC, Globe and Mail, National Post, right? So I can look at all sorts of things, and I can judge information based on a wide range of inputs. But the suspicion that the U.S. right wing has of news sources outside of the kind of core ecosystem makes it very hard to challenge the messages that they say they get from Fox News, and it's dreadful talking heads.
Mm-hmm.
Dreadful talking heads indeed. And I mean, just yesterday, I think, was it yesterday or today, Franklin Graham pronounced that coronavirus was punishment from God for our sin. And he just got to say that unchallenged on a primetime Fox show, Judge Napolitano.
I mean, it may be that,
Or Judge somebody.
that
Sorry, go on.
that gay marriage I told you that I got last year. Maybe this is my fault.
Yeah. Thanks a lot, Simon.
So all right, what god do we have to feed you to now then to make it stop?
Usually it's the
Or is it
volcano
too late
god.
for that? Don't worry, we won't feed you to any god, even if it would stop the crisis. I'm going to be Dostoevskian on that ethical stance.
I had to sell my sacrificial altar to make rent.
So we're talking about the U.S. right wing, and I want to use this to segue into something that I'm following with, I wouldn't say a great deal of panic yet, but certainly some concern. And that is the way that the real fringe right, and I mean the militant right in the U.S., is approaching the pandemic. So there's already sort of chatter and exhortations on the militant right-wing cesspit of the internet that white supremacist activists should try to infect Jews as much as possible. So they should try to go to Jewish neighborhoods and spread COVID-19. Mm-hmm. And there have been a couple. There was an attempted bombing of a hospital, which was averted after the FBI shot the would-be attacker dead. There was a train derailment in New York City where someone who thought that the USS Comfort, the hospital ship that's now docked there, was part of some sort of global or national or global conspiracy, and that this person could call attention to it by derailing a train at it. So I'm not sure that we are seeing the situation for some sort of real populist militancy to arise, because to have populist militancy, you have to be able to go outside and get together and form groups and organize, and that's not happening as much. But the potential for people locked in their homes, glued to their propaganda sources of choice, forming ever more extreme, ever more paranoid, and more militant views about what's happening and what should be done, is a very real possibility. And I've seen some indication that the FBI is taking this fairly seriously and sort of reprioritizing white supremacist terrorism more so than they have in the past, which is probably a good shift. I'm less familiar with what's happening in Canada about this. I do know that ISIS has issued a travel advisory for Europe. They've suggested to ISIS members that maybe don't go to Europe to do jihad for a little while because you might get sick.
Wow.
Yeah.
Which is epic trolling, to be sure. but there was recently just a stabbing attack in France. So terrorism is happening, and nefarious actors are using the chaos or trying to exploit the chaos. But it looks like the big white supremacist threat is mostly in the U.S. and isn't likely to take a kind of gigantic populist form, but is certainly developing.
So this brings me to my second feeder question for you. What stands out to you about the crisis? Now you regret asking me to ask you that.
Yeah, well, mostly because it opens up a very broad horizon of ways to answer it, and I have to come up with something interesting that I haven't already said.
Yes, you do. Yes.
So there are a lot of ways in which we're all fucked.
Yeah.
Right? So I talked about some of the more abstract or longer term ways in which this crisis will lead to potential reconfigurations in international distributions of authority and alliance. Then there are some medium-term things which I feel a little bit safer talking about. So one of which is that the UK and the EU were supposed to figure their shit out, if you'll pardon my language, by the end of the year. They should have been having lots of meetings to determine the shape of everything from
By the end of last
guaranteeing
year, you mean?
guaranteeing trade supply to figuring out issues like security cooperation, right?
Right.
And intelligence sharing. And these are all now very slow. I mean, they can't really proceed. And so far, the UK government has indicated that it's not going to ask for an extension on this, an extension of the current arrangements, which are legacy EU arrangements. But if there is no extension and these deals are not worked out by the end of the year, then a whole bunch of things stop. And one of the things that we're seeing everywhere, but especially in the UK and EU, is that even small fluctuations in demand or supply can lead to a lot of empty shelves because supply chains are all just in time, right? So if there's like a 15% increase in demand for toilet paper, that means that now everyone's out of toilet paper, right? And for some reason, everybody made a run on toilet roll. Like, what's with the but like obviously like runs are self-sustaining, right? So that some people go, oh my god, better stock up on toilet roll, and then everyone goes, oh my god, if we don't buy toilet roll now, that we'll be out of it, and then they go and start buying it, and then even though it was only like 3 panicked fools, like now, like everyone's wiping their ass with I don't know, the Times, with the Daily Mail.
Yeah.
I'm not sure. I think it's probably too good of a fate for the Daily Mail. So that kind of medium term stuff stands out to me. The distinct unfriendliness of the US's relations with Canada stand out to me, and I think Canadians will remember this. That may have knock-on effects in terms of our own supply structures. I think that a lot of countries will move toward greater self-sufficiency in some industrial areas as a result of this. And so this could lead to some transformations in global trade arrangements in ways that I don't feel comfortable talking about, because that's international political economy and not enough people are shooting each other. So I thought it was boring when I first got to study it. So I didn't really study it. Not enough explosions.
Well, certainly I feel within myself the urge to support political action federally, provincially, that moves towards national stockpiling of pandemic preparation supplies, permanent creation of the capacity to rapidly create pandemic supplies should the need arise again.
I think that there has been a perception of epidemic disease as something that happens to foreign Orientals or like people on the dark continent of Africa, and so epidemics and pandemics have been processed through a kind of racial lens of distance and foreignness. And now that it's happening here, I think people might take it seriously, right? Because previous to this, most people's main interaction with pandemic illness is through the sort of stereotypical lenses of news broadcasts, and not confronting the fact that they've just lost relatives and they can't even go to those relatives' funerals. One of the things that I've been hearing that I find very interesting is that COVID-19 is hitting the ultra-Orthodox Jewish communities in both New York and Israel really hard, because these communities traditionally deeply mistrust and generally ignore the government, and so they haven't been following government advice. I heard an absolutely heartbreaking story of an ER nurse who was tending to a dying ultra-Orthodox woman, and the woman's son called and demanded that she put the speakerphone next to the now unconscious mother so that he could recite for her the prayer of the dead. And I saw a video of ultra-Orthodox Jews. Some of them, so one set of ultra-Orthodox Jews in Israel coughing on the cops, the Israeli cops, as they try to enforce distance and calling them Nazis. And then another video of more conscientious Orthodox Jews calling the first bunch murderers from their balconies and windows, shouting killers down at them. And so this is interesting to me because I'm Jewish and I've lived in Israel, and so this is like a more specific area of interest for me personally. But it will be interesting to see how smaller communities across the world that generally haven't trusted governments might begin to do so. They might start to develop a greater willingness to take government advice on certain issues. And conversely, some communities might be totally alienated from the government, right? Like, look at the degree of independent state action in the US that has become a necessity because the federal government is so useless there. So will that lead to more autonomy in states in the future? So there'll be, yeah.
There are even, I read today now, coalitions of states forming together to create bargaining units to buy PPE to stop each other from bidding them up. And somebody on Twitter said, if only there were some entity that exists in these times to help these 50 states see themselves through these matters.
Some way to unite the states, perhaps.
So one thing that kind of goes back to the idea of this being a global problem, but also, a local problem, is that our society, especially liberal society, kind of individually focused, marketized, it's very much built around a business as usual vision of the future. So most of our arrangements are designed to produce a harmonious and wealth-generating context for as many people as possible, so long as there aren't any major gigantic crises, right? And the idea of catastrophe, the idea of something catastrophic happening that causes everything to stop, and like some sort of gigantic existential threat to face a community, I don't think that this is normally part of the way that we think about political possibility or institutional possibility. And now we're going to have to. Mm-hmm. And some countries or communities might be better at doing that than others. One of my former faculty members at the University of Toronto, Dr. Aisha Ahmed, has written a couple of good articles saying, let me tell you what it's like having lived in places where we do confront catastrophe and calamity more often. Like, let me talk you through the feelings you're going through. Let me reassure you that you don't have to be productive right now. Let me tell you how you will slowly become more productive as time goes on and you get used to this as the new normal, etc. And this is all new to us here. So I'm not sure what sorts of political changes will take place in the way that we understand our communities and the sorts of government that we want or the sorts of government that we build now that catastrophe and calamity are within our political consciousness. But something tells me there's going to be changes, and I hope they're for the better.
Here's a question that I've been thinking about. We've seen examples of the striking degree of difference that good governance is making from bad governance as this thing unfolds. Are we looking at possible futures where government is actually seen as a noble calling and an aspiration again? If it ever was, I don't know. The civil service as a serious thing to aspire to. Maybe this is getting too specific for a politics question, but I don't know. Just you can riff on that.
I don't know. I suspect that, wouldn't that be nice? I do suspect. So I see a lot of people using the war metaphor to talk about the situation we're facing. This is a war, and I'm not really sure who the enemy is. The novel coronavirus, maybe.
Put more people on the battleships, quick! Oh no, wait.
Well, but so who's the army in this metaphor? Well, the army are valiant soldiers and defenders, are healthcare personnel. Mm-hmm. And I think so. This war metaphor. So first of all, this produced some absolutely fucking stupid outcomes in the UK, where it's a war. We've got to act like it's the Blitz. Everybody continue as usual because that's how you show resilience. So that was dismaying to see, and it's like, oh my God, is this the only frame of reference that you people have for collective action? But once everyone kind of gets over that, the war metaphor is potent because it's a metaphor for collective action, mobilization against a common threat, toward a common outcome, the willingness to endure hardship, the idea that everybody has to make sacrifices, and our army, our healthcare personnel. And so instead of maybe in the future celebrating soldiers and as the US will do, let them board planes first, continually thank them, maybe we'll see a greater appreciation for healthcare providers, and not just doctors, but like nurses and lab techs and people doing the difficult logistical jobs right now. That it's these people who are our new heroes.
Grocery
And
store workers,
yeah,
janitors.
you know, I went for a takeaway coffee at one of my favorite local coffee shops in Vancouver, and I said, do you have people coming in here saying like this is the only, getting a coffee to go from this place is like their only sense of normalcy? And the guy says, yeah, like I feel like I'm actually performing a community service here, and I'm happy to come here each day despite the risk, because I feel like this is one of the few comforts that people have during an unfamiliar time. And I think that hopefully, wouldn't it be nice if all of us began to appreciate a vital role that that people in menial jobs play in letting us feel at home and comfortable and safe.
Yeah,
I've certainly been letting them know myself more than usual. I mean, I'm a person who says thank you when I get off the bus all the time, but now even getting my groceries, I tell them I appreciate your work. Like very specifically say things like that, because they're again putting themselves on the front line so that we can get food, and it needs to happen. They're probably not paid great, and they probably get treated like dirt a lot of the times, and I want to let them know that at least I give a crap.
But at the same time, I am a little concerned about the war metaphor here. As much as I like the idea of treating of shifting from armed military personnel to healthcare workers and supermarket workers as our the new soldiers are. I'm concerned by the war metaphor because like this isn't a war. There isn't wars are political situations in which we try to resolve conflicts over outcomes and over moral problems through force of violence. And so, as potent as it may be to mobilize everyone around this idea of a war, we've seen with the war on terror and the war on drugs that trying to wage war against abstract things or things that aren't really other political entities runs the risk of like massive investment of resources. It runs the risk of militarizing this. Like the more this is a war, the more people might be ready to deploy military personnel to enforce lockdowns, maybe, or to manage disaster responses. And sometimes the military is organizationally and logistically the entity best able to manage a disaster situation. But I'm hoping that will not ever be the case for us. And so I would say that the war metaphor is kind of a double-edged sword. And my friend Eric, who teaches at Carleton, has just written a tweet thread about this and recently a blog post. So if you go to Eric Van Rijthoven's Twitter feed, you can find it, or on my Twitter feed, I've retweeted it. It would be Simon_the_Pratt. So I encourage reading and thinking about this, and it would be nice to see some exploration of alternative metaphors or alternative frames of collective action or collective mobilization than the war one, as useful as it might be, or as motivating as it might be.
We've never had to craft one before. We're literally having to create our own new narrative, since this event is just so singular in all of our lives.
Great. If the outcome of this is that we come up with a different frame of reference than war, a new frame of reference for collective, like if we come up with the metaphor of pandemic response as a way to understand collective action and community defense against a great danger and a disaster, then that would be inspiring to me. That would give me a lot more hope for the longer term threat of climate change, because I feel that because climate change isn't a war, maybe people are less able to understand how to mobilize and come together to fight it. But if we conceive of climate change as like a very long-term pandemic about to happen, maybe that will put us in a better position.
You mean all that firing of weapons at clouds has not been effective? I've been making some terrible mistakes.
If you just fire enough ordnance at those cumulonimbus cloud formations, eventually they'll disperse.
There's Klingon wisdom about this.
Yeah.
The Klingons understand this. The wind does not respect a fool, Torin.
Oh, that's right.
And today is First Contact Day. Speaking of metaphors that have been offered in popular culture.
Wow.
I'm very ready for there to be as much Star Trek discussion as possible in figuring out our responses. But I think my students are now too young to have any Star Trek familiarity. So I've tried to make Next Generation DS9 references to my students, and no one ever gets it.
Have you
Go
got
on
any
Netflix,
handy?
come on.
How about Picard or Discovery references?
I pretend that Discovery didn't happen, so I may or may not have watched it, but I do not know of what you speak.
All right.
Picard, I have some mixed feelings on. Although now that you bring up Picard, I'm going to talk about AI now, because I've noticed that one of the consequences of the need for contact tracing has been the use of invasive surveillance systems and AI-driven algorithms to try to engage in contact tracing or to manage some of the more complex healthcare informational needs.
Are these
What do you mean by
apps that
contact
alert
tracing?
you when you're near someone?
So there's that. That would be the kind of the extreme South Korean response. But also, I saw a couple news stories. I think it's Simona Guerrera is the person on the academic who's been publicizing this. Although I can't remember for sure. Could be wrong about that. She may have just been the person who retweeted it. But the UK is now contracting or about ready to contract to Palantir some of their NHS information management stuff. So
great.
and Israel's been using its counterterrorism surveillance system run by Shabak, the General Security Service, to let people know when they've been near someone who is infected. So the crisis situation doesn't can be exploited and is being exploited by governments to install much more invasive surveillance technologies, and these might help in the short term. But if we are willing to accept that they help in the short term and to accept them in the short term, we better be aware of them and treat them as a truly exceptional measure, because in the longer term we may find ourselves with considerably less privacy or control over our data. And even just we were talking about this in private earlier, but I was saying that I'm very reluctant to use Zoom, because Zoom has been collecting and marketizing huge amounts of user data. So also, if we're talking about the surveillance situation here and the AI situation, if we have to continue with social distancing or physical distancing well into the next year as we wait for a vaccine, we will become increasingly reliant on digital technologies and on algorithmically supported sort of mitigation measures. And in the process, we could see a lot, sort of much more deeper and invasive harvesting and use of our data, both by companies and data mining firms and by governments.
Yeah, all these people who will see this as an opportunity rather than both an opportunity and a problem, but they will see their opportunity to position themselves in whatever the new structure that our society has based on our response to this. Yeah. Use
also,
Signal Messenger, people. That's my advice.
When Trudeau announced in his morning briefing that Amazon would be delivering PPE and not Purolator, jaw actually dropped. What? So imagine that, but for a whole host of digital technologies and service delivery, not just in the physical form, but in the sort of digital form. That would be something that would disturb me, because I'm not actually convinced that the private sector should be handling these things and that the private sector has our best interests in mind. Whereas I'm increasingly comfortable with government in certain respects, as I see Bonnie Henry's briefings. I think, wow, is this what government could be? As Rob was saying earlier, actually, I have a lot of trust and respect for this.
Yeah, we're in very good hands, and that's just evident day after day after day after day. And it's sort of, oh, this isn't what Reagan told us about government. This isn't it at all. They're from the government, and they actually are here to help, and they're helping massively.
Yeah. It's been nice to see the changes in America where several of them are, right? I totally get their federal response seems to be mostly garbage, But like New York's Governor Cuomo seems to have stepped up. He really gets it these days. He's out there taking it very seriously, seems to be doing his job. And like it's nice to see that. It's nice to see Americans in government who aren't just there to help out their rich buddies get even richer, which seems to be what most American politicians want to do.
So yes, like Cuomo seems unwilling to leave New York residents to die, but on the other hand, he seems certainly willing to continue unjust and deeply racist criminal justice measures that see people thrown into death trap prisons like Rikers, where they will catch COVID. They will develop COVID-19 at like 20 times the baseline rate of the population or something, right? So so I think that I've yet to see a response from the U.S. that strikes me as anything remotely resembling best practices coming out of, say, Germany or Canada or BC, right? Like I think that what we're mostly seeing in the U.S. is that the U.S. is deeply pathological at every level of government, and even its best responses are still really bad in a whole bunch of ways, in ways that I find actually profoundly depressing. And so I try to think about them only for a limited period of time each day.
Yeah, I guess my bar for American politicians is super, super low. So when I see them even do a half-assed job that takes it sort of seriously, I go, oh, wow, check that out. Oh, they're not all totally terrible. He's only partly terrible.
I think one of my favorite stories has been the University of Washington, where they just got so tired of waiting for CDC to bring tests that they just said, screw it, we're just going to create a testing lab and we're going to get a testing program rolling for Washington State. And I think that's played a huge role in helping Washington in particular get a handle on their outbreak and start to turn the corner, which is becoming more and more evident that they are either near or past their peak, and thank goodness, because they were on a runaway train before that.
And so, I mean, one thing that might happen as the world looks at the U.S. Sort of shooting itself in the foot over and over and over again on this is the possibility that countries will begin to look for other international partners and become very, very suspicious.
This was our hegemon?
So some people have suggested that China is ready to swoop in and be the new the new responsible international hegemon of choice.
Oh,
and
really?
And I'm a bit skeptical of that, especially as information sort of slowly emerges that China might have underreported their deaths and cases by about a factor. So
a factor of what?
Of 10.
Oh, so okay, one log, boom.
Order of magnitude. Yeah, wow. Okay.
So Reuters came out with the story, and then there was a bunch of American intelligence sources who leaked this that it might be closer to like 30 to 40,000 dead people. And the thing is that sort of information about just how many people are dying of COVID-19 would have been pretty crucial for other governments to have as early as possible, right?
Absolutely.
So the readiness of other countries to trust that forming enduring partnerships with China is in their best interest. I'm not sure that there'll be a lot of that trust.
So that's interesting because the mortality figures out of Italy were so much higher than those out of China, and I remember just scrambling, thinking, I had taken on faith the Chinese figures were accurately reported. And I thought, I wonder what the relevant different explanations are that could account for this mortality increase in Italy versus China. And it sent a lot of doctors just chasing rabbits through fields fruitlessly when, oh no, actually, this is just a damn lethal virus. And it's just a lot of people.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not a China expert, and these are just a few news stories. So do not take this as truth. Take this as a plausible possibility among several. But yes, I think a lot of us should be generally suspicious of the data that we on cases, right? Some countries have been very good at producing reliable, consistent test data. So obviously South Korea, Germany. Many people are going untested in the UK, and I think quite a few people in Italy were untested. There were only people who required hospitalization, if I understand. So so I think it's hard to look at different countries reporting on this and then make general conclusions. What you need is to talk to a lot of different country experts who can contextualize the country-specific systems for testing and hospitalization, and then also account for the possibility of underreporting or various forms of sort of government censorship or data manipulation, which is obviously going to be more of a problem in some places than others.
And even as a testing regimen within a specific locale, its goals change over time as the goals of pandemic control change. So initially, the strategy in BC was containment, and testing was focused on anybody getting off of airplanes and individuals around them. That then, once we shifted to the realization that there was significant community spread, all right, now we're in a phase of mitigation. We're not in a phase of containment anymore. So our testing strategy has to change, and we have to fall back on more general advice for people with respiratory symptoms. If you have them, assume you have the disease, stay at home. We have to focus our testing efforts on healthcare workers. So you can't even really compare testing figures from mid-February to mid-March and say that you're getting an apples to apples comparison, because so across countries, that's going to be an even more difficult problem.
I mean, I would say that earlier on, especially during my immensely boring quarantine period, I was sort of I had one of my screens sort of constantly taken up with this self-updating, fancy looking like situation room style GIS map showing me case rates, and I've just basically stopped checking that because I no longer find it useful as because of changing in testing, and also because of how the more I learn about different testing strategies and data problems, the less useful I find those maps. And if anyone else who's kind of glued to that, unless you're really bored and in quarantine, in which case you should maybe, I don't know, do yoga instead. Actually, as a general rule, I would suggest yoga and then maybe like an unreasonable number of burpees. I'm trying to do lots of burpees these days.
Unreasonable numbers of burpees. Did you try the death by burpees exercise that I suggest?
I did, and I feel kind of out of shape because I didn't get too far. Now that I'm no longer confined, I do a daily run around Trout Lake, but I've been
we're in the same neighborhood.
Commercial Drive area, but when the weather is shit, I've been doing seeing how long it takes me to do 100 burpees, so I can sort of try to bring that down to, under 10 minutes.
Okay.
So my hope is like when I'm eventually allowed to train Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu again, in like God knows when, I'll be like super mobile from all the yoga, and I'll just be this like cardio machine from all of the burpees and sprints I've been doing. I won't know how to do it anymore, so I'll flail around uselessly. But at least I'll be able to do that for a very long period of time and with a great deal of range of motion.
I hooked up my Kinect for the first time in like 5 years.
Oh,
doing that Star Wars dance party that Joe hates so much.
Oh my God, I'm Han Solo.
So we're gonna have to. This reminds me, we're probably gonna have to get somebody on here who can help us all stay in shape while we're confined. Because I think that's an issue. In the Hong Kong flu outbreak of 1998, there was significantly lower mortality in individuals who had moderate level physical fitness, and they defined that as working out about 3 times a week. If you worked out less than that, you had higher mortality. If you worked out more than that, you had higher mortality. So something about elite levels of fitness also ended up being a vulnerability factor. So you've got to get people moving towards that top of the U curve where they're moderately fit. And I'm not there right now.
I mean, my goal is usually to be immoderately fit, but I think I can safely say I'm pretty far from like an elite level of fitness. To turn this back to an international relations issue,
right.
For a moment, one of the things that I've noticed is as people deal with the boredom and mental health challenges of being stuck at home all the time, they are increasingly immersed in a very international information environment. So my mother, in whose condo I and my husband certainly currently are staying until we move into our sublet, she's often showing me news stories about South America or about Europe, and I'm frequently checking in with my colleagues from Italy and Spain, in particular, to ask how their families are surviving. And the stories that I see people talking about, even if they're Canadians who aren't, like international people, who do a lot of travel for work, is a great deal more awareness of and engagement with global news stories, which kind of feeds back to the way that this is being experienced as a global event. But I wouldn't downplay the fact that part of the global nature of this event is just that everybody is bored and at home, so all they have is their internet, and the internet has a way of collapsing geographic distances, right? Collapsing physical distances, projecting people into a social geography that doesn't kind of ignores, it doesn't ignore linguistic boundaries, but does ignore geographic ones, or physical geographic ones, I should say.
Yeah, I know that we've at least got people from Poland watching right now. Witchy Peach did a host on us, which means anybody watching her Twitch channel is automatically seeing this on theirs. I know she's in Poland. And we've got a doctor from New York in chat. Yeah, people from all over the place. And I agree with you on that. I have a question, and I know that this is going to be difficult to predict because we're still figuring out all of this. But as a renter who tends to be relatively low income, what the heck are we going to do about rent in the next several months? What is the new normal going to be about that? Because as time goes on, less and less people are just going to be able to pay their rent because they're not working anymore.
So, unless this starts to involve a great deal of terrorism, I'm not sure that rent is really in my lane.
Okay.
Although once the rent strikers start suicide bombing, you should definitely reach out to me.
Okay.
But speaking personally, because I had to sublet an apartment here after the Queer Airbnb, I'm subletting a place, right? I don't want to live with my mother for obvious reasons. Wait, no, that came out wrong. because she's older and vulnerable.
Your mother's not older? Tell us how that time travel works.
So she's muttering to my right.
Yes.
Oh, we hear her.
We can hear it.
So I was looking at paying like double rents, and my rent in Bristol is just as high as rents on one bedrooms are here in Vancouver, which is fucking high. So I asked my landlord for a rent reduction, and she had my rent for 2 months. And I'm choosing to think of this as kindness rather than a general calculation that many landlords are making, which is if it's all or nothing, what are the odds that I just get nothing, right? And I'm sure as hell surprised that like Doug Ford is the one to say if you don't have the money to pay your rent, don't pay it. Like when Tories are telling us we don't have to pay rent, that's shocking. But I suspect the kind of long-term effect is likely to be that like rent becomes lower, right?
Lower.
If people can't afford high rents, landlords will start trying to charge them much lower rents so that they can get something, right?
Right.
I think.
Just to interject for a second, Doug Ford has been a thoroughly pleasant surprise on the COVID-19 file, I have to say.
I disagree. I find nothing pleasant about Doug Ford. I'm surprised, but also populist, leaning into economic populism. Like that's not actually that much of a shocker. And I find him and his government loathsome. That's kind of the end of it, really.
All right.
Good. Yeah, he's awful. So I guess if rents get lower, does that mean that banks then have to lower mortgages, which people are paying for those a lot of people anyway, not everybody, many people outright own their rental properties, but a lot of people are paying mortgages on those properties and they expect the rent to cover it. And if the rent's now lower, does that just mean that they're going to be... I saw a big Twitter thing from some fairly socialist people going, hey, guess what? People who get their money from rental income, that was an investment, and your investment is not guaranteed to make a profit. So guess what? Right now you don't. You get to make less. That can't carry on forever, right? We need to hit some new equilibrium somehow.
So my attempts at political philosophy are boring and underinformed, and so I'm going to spare you them.
Okay.
What I do, one way for
Mine
me
are
to
exciting
approach,
and uninformed. We're gonna live in rockets.
everyone thinks that their political philosophy is exciting and uninformed, except those who actually have met exciting and informed political theorists, as I've been privileged to meet, and then afterwards you go like, like I really don't know this shit, do I? But there is a question to ask about what happens to international finance, because a whole lot of people are not going to make payments that they thought they're going to be able to make.
Yeah.
And I suspect that banks and financiers will have to adjust their expectations, and they will do so. And there will be a recession, and it might not last very long. My investments have taken a big hit. At least I have investments, right? But I'm hoping not to draw on them anytime soon.
Woohoo! Paid off being poor.
Yeah.
Sort of.
And I don't know when they'll recover, but they probably will at some point. But yeah, I think that one thing that I'll want to look at going forward is whether differences in how well governments weather the outcomes of the situation, and how well their economies restart after this, and when they restart, whether this leads to changes in the flow of capital and finance across borders, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because it may make new places seem like safer bets. It may, premature economy restarting might actually cause like financial misery in unforeseen ways. So, like I said, like not enough people were killing each other for me to really want to study international political economy. But like as you sort of referenced by talking about the mortgage and debt side of rent collection on housing, there's a really complex finance and lending system that needs to adapt to the situation. And right now, everyone is kind of staying home, and so we're not really thinking about that because we're too busy thinking about where our next paycheck comes from.
And the toilet paper.
Yeah, and where we're going to source toilet paper. Look, go to small grocery stores. Go to Asian grocery stores. They're well stocked. Like, yeah, like otherwise you have to go and like intercept people at Safeway. And,
I said this in a previous episode. I've given up on toilet paper. There's a shower in the same room. Everything's fine. Why waste
Italians had their bidets. Italian households are really big on
If
bidets.
I could afford a warm water one, I'd do it. I'm terrified of squirting cold water up there. So
do you know what a washlet is? Have you ever been to Japan?
No.
You should treat yourself.
I can Google. There's an internet right in front. Washlet, L-E-T?
Yeah.
Toto Washlet. Meet the Toto Washlet. Oh, free advertising. Refresh your routine. Play video. Nope, not going to play the video. I'm not going to hit play video.
Thank you.
Okay, I'll check that out.
Have we well and truly exhausted this conversation?
But I'm
once again
on
the toilet.
Listen, we got to talk about my butt every episode. It's clean, Rob.
We
it's
don't
clean.
though. We don't.
It's cleaner than it's been in years because of this.
Oh, here we go.
I'll say it again. Toilet paper is terrible.
He can't stop.
Toilet paper's terrible. Hey, we've had the serious conversation. Now I get to talk about how toilet paper is terrible. It's terrible, and it's made from like trees.
Other unserious topics, though. It can't just be your shiny butt.
Let me talk about my Minecraft game and how much time I've been able to invest in that. Yeah, there you go. The one thing that came out of this pandemic: a cleaner my butt.
I mean, there's I think there are interesting implications for public hygiene here. I've been greeting people with "Live long and prosper," because I can't shake their hands.
Mm-hmm.
But like, did Did we all pay attention to the whole Trump handshake masculinity performance thing where he like grabs people's hands and then yanks them forward? Then there was this whole thing where Trudeau didn't let him, and you could like see like Trudeau's kind of bicep bulging as he kept Trump. There was like a follow-up news story that says Trudeau actually trained this with his aides. He trained to resist the dickhead Trump handshake.
Yep.
And this makes me think. This makes me think a lot about diplomatic performances and hygiene, right? So, like, what are some of the ways in which physical closeness and physical interaction feature in our politics, and how will this change going forward? Will this change the kind of diplomatic pageantry around summits? Will we see more international diplomacy conducted remotely? And I will say that, like often, like getting a bunch of people into a room. I mean, it matters. You know, if you're arguing with your spouse, as I of course never do, having a conversation in person is much more effective than doing it over WhatsApp and exchanging passive aggressive messages, which of course I never do. So, is there a diplomatic equivalent of this? What do we see? What's the outcome of social distancing and voting? How is the GOP going to exploit this to further advantage Trump in the November election? If the UK does manage to somehow negotiate something via digital distance, what does that mean for the future of international summits? There are these sorts of questions where, I don't know whether bum hygiene is as sort of significant as. At this point, I leave. My mother is leaving the room. She's been on her computer somewhere to the right. In this small house where the one side of this conversation that she hears are my responses. But the question of how is our new hyper awareness of hygiene going to influence politics is a good one.
Mm-hmm. Maybe they'll have conversations about bidets and have the Europeans try to get the Americans to use them. And that's all I got. All I got is butt talk, because that's been my biggest problem these days and my biggest triumph at the same time. Is there anything you want to adjourn this conversation with? Any final questions you want to put to me before I want to know how Torrens' butt is?
How about something more like a realistically? What are some sources of realistic optimism in global relations? I don't want the Pollyanna scenario, but where do you see real rays of light?
We'll get through this.
Yeah.
And as a consequence of getting through it, we may learn to be together and work together in ways that will serve us very well moving forward.
Mm-hmm.
I like that.
And it will suck, but then it will hopefully suck less.
It will suck less. You heard it here.
All right.
That's our university lecturer, Dr. Simon Pratt. University.
Thanks for showing up.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me. Can I hang this up now and go get some food?
You have our permission.
Okay.
Yeah, sure.
Yep.
We'll do a real quick goodbye first. I think there was discussion that we're going to start an hour earlier next week. We're going to 7:00 p.m. Pacific time is the time when everybody goes out and does a big cheer for our health workers. And our idea was to start our next episode pretty much immediately after that cheer. We're going to let the cheer happen, and then we're going to start our stream. Does that sound right, Rob?
That works for me.
Okay.
Yeah, because I like to be out on the patio doing the cheer.
Yeah.
So rush in here, hop on the mic.
I could even probably stream from my phone the cheer, or you could do it yourself to it or something like that, so that we could let people see that before we start. That might be fun. We'll figure that out. But just a note to everybody, we're going to be starting at 7:00 instead of 8:00 next week.
And that'll be the new normal.
Oh.
International relations already improving by 1 hour.
All right. Thanks, Simon. Have a good night.
You too. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody.